Welcome back to 15 Who Dare to Dream. We are profiling 15 men and women who made an indelible impact on our history in this region.
Our next history maker was a man who helped launch the careers of many black businessmen back in the 1930s and 40s, as well as doctors, lawyers, and political figures. But in addition to helping others, our next honoree had a fascinating history all his own. From the 1920s through the 40s, Gus Greenlee was a larger-than-life character in Pittsburgh. He was the city's largest numbers banker, an illegal but highly popular form of lottery.
Gus was the man on the hill. And by the 1920s, he has a bar called the Crawford Grill on Crawford Street, a place which becomes a real mecca for jazz lovers.
In his heyday, Greenlee's revenues from the numbers racket were estimated at $25,000 a day. But having a ready supply of cash made Greenlee more than a gambler. In a time when white banks turned a deaf ear to blacks, Greenlee was one of the only sources for a loan, and he often stepped in times of desperation.
People were always coming up to Gus and asking for a loan to help them pay for rent, to pay for a load of coal, to pay for a doctor's bill. And usually the expectation was that they weren't going to have to pay it back, that that's what Gus did.
In addition to operating the Crawford Grill, Gus Greenlee is also celebrated today for bankrolling one of the best baseball teams ever to play the game, the Pittsburgh Crawfords. Josh Gibson, Satchel Paige, Cool Papa Bell, Oscar Charleston, just a few members of a legendary all-black team based here in Pittsburgh. During the 1930s, the Crawfords were probably the best team in baseball and regularly beat all-star teams of white major leaguers. And surprisingly, the Crawfords' biggest rivals were another black team that also called the Pittsburgh area home, the Homestead Grays. And the man who ran that team was as different from Gus Greenlee as night and day. Cumberland Posey was a shrewd businessman and turned the Grays into perennial Negro League champions. Huge crowds of blacks and whites came out to see the Grays play wherever they traveled. Posey booked his Grays into Forbes Field when the Pirates were out of town.
As the years went by, the Stars became ours. We owned them. We were very proud of them. They served as good role models for the kids because the majority of the players in those days were straight down the line fellows. They weren't roustabouts, they weren't thugs, and they always gave a good account of themselves.
Next on our list of the 15 who dare to dream is a woman who was a feisty force for change in Pittsburgh's civil rights movement. During the 50s and 60s, the civil rights movement in Pittsburgh fought hard for equality, freedom, and fair economic practices. Photos and film footage of those historic events are dominated by male faces, but Alma Speed Fox played a pivotal role in those history-making events as well, even though she preferred to avoid marching at the front of the column. Fox took part in hundreds of demonstrations and held a leadership role in the NAACP and several other civil rights groups of the time.
Alma Fox is just Miss NAACP, the living truth.
We were stubborn and we persevered. We didn't have any place to go but up.
Here at the grave of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr., participants in the Poor People's March came by long enough to pay their respects to this man who originally had the idea of the march.
In 1962, Pittsburgher Mal Good became America's first African-American network news correspondent when he was hired by ABC. During his time at ABC News, he reported on the United Nations, the Civil Rights Movement, and the Cuban Missile Crisis. But he began his broadcasting career in radio, right here in Pittsburgh. For many years, Good and his sister, Mary D., hosted a popular radio program at WHOD. Good was also a reporter for the Pittsburgh Courier and worked at KQV. Although he was the first black network reporter, Good's opportunity to work at the network level didn't come until he was in his 50s.
He met up with a lot of problems being the first trailblazer. And in an industry where most people go in their 20s and their 30s, he actually went in with one foot in the grave. He was 54 before ABC finally took that jump
In a broadcasting career that spanned 3 decades, Mel Good blazed a trail for every African-American reporter who has followed in his footsteps.
I'd really like to be remembered as somebody who tried to do something to make life better for somebody. Not better for black people, not better for Afro-Americans, not better for white people, but better for humanity.
At number 7, it's a guy who's so famous, his statue at the airport is right next to George Washington's. Franco Harris led the Steelers to 4 Super Bowl championships in the 80s. He may be best remembered for his role in the Immaculate Reception, but over a 12-year career, Franco was an 8-time Pro Bowler, a Super Bowl MVP, and is now a member of the Pro Football Hall of Fame. And after his playing days were over, Franco stayed right here in Pittsburgh, where he's become a successful entrepreneur and businessman.
Franco's amazing career is immortalized both at the Pittsburgh International Airport and the Western Pennsylvania Sports Museum, where you can see him making, frozen in time, his Immaculate Reception.
When we return, a legendary World War II correspondent, a tireless champion for the cause of social justice, and a magician on the baseball diamond. That's all ahead when 15 Who Dare to Dream continues. Stay with us.